First stop is a garden being attended by soldiers. Well, there is a ceasefire in Bosnia at the moment, and NATO's troops are taking this chance for a retreat. Let's head on over to our boys in Stars and Stripes at the USS Carl Vinson. It's a cool name for an aircraft carrier. All the men here are either doing exercises or are ready for their next sortie. Pilots, engineers, and fighter jets galore. Well, that all stops when these two pilots are stopped for launch for the second time today. Pilots Chris Burnett and Jeremy Stackhouse are debating about how they could be flying jets for Bill Gates right now since he's got more money than Peru.
Bill Gates has more money than Peru.
The two disembark from their fighter jet, and they see some of the engineers relaxing with a rousing game of football. So the two pilots join them for their free time. Chris bets $20 that he could catch that football that's launched by the carrier's flight catapult. One of the engineers accepts, and another one winds that catapult. It launches and it flings that ball sky high. Is good. Due to the launch direction being opposite to the wind's direction, it's coming back, and Chris runs after it. Too bad it lands in water. Moments pass and a Black Hawk arrives. Then we're taken to Admiral Juan Miguel Paquette, where he reviews some papers. Admiral Leslie Reigart and his consort are there alongside him. Now, Admiral Paquette commands that Reigart says a lot of guys here are up in the air despite the treaty that's going on.
You understand how important it is.
And that he reminds him that the treaty is fragile. Reigart assures him that they'll follow the flight route strictly, and then Paquette hands him over the card of a press member that Reigart should welcome with open arms. He finds the press to be annoying, but he has his orders. Lunchtime, time for that grub, and Chris and Jeremy are sure to be enjoying the cafeteria. Then they get a surprise visit from Marine Captain Glenn Rodway, and he says he's here to pump up the two pilots, because there might be a mission at hand. Captain Rodway wants him to take this seriously, as Chris just wants to fight that he could understand.
Don't you forget what you're doing.
Suddenly, Jeremy points out to his two associates that there's a push-up contest, causing a fiasco behind him. Chris says it's exactly how he pictures it. Before, it used to be about punching the Austrian painter, but now these days are long gone.
They're long gone.
Suddenly, some soldiers come in to call Chris out from across the room, and he says Reigart wants to see him, so he follows him. On the way, Chris is quite the chatterbox, talking to Master Chief Tom O'Malley, but even he doesn't know why Reigart wants to see him. They arrive at Reigart's quarters, and the Admiral says that he has Chris's letter that he eventually wants to leave the Navy because he wants to move on. The Admiral's then confused what Chris is going to move on to.
Move on to what?
And then he tells him a string of misdemeanors across Asian armies. Chris says that he's getting tired of the police-like routine, stating he wanted to be a fighter pilot, not a cop. The Admiral says they're at war, but Chris begs to differ. Basically, Chris is hungry for some action, but all they're doing is guarding airspace. Chris says he's got 7 years already for serving his country, but the Admiral gets annoyed at his snarky attitude, so he gives him 2 weeks for his tour to end, and then he can flock off. He's dismissed.
You're dismissed, mister.
And then Jeremy hears the news from O'Malley saying that he's gonna quit. Chris is totally done, so Jeremy might have to find a new navigator. Some time passes, and it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas in the carrier. Chris calls his father about the holidays, and he does miss his little boy. Chris says his farewells to his dad, and he sees that he and Jeremy are gonna go on recon for the holidays. He's not too thrilled about it, but Jeremy says at least they get to fly. Time to rock that walk of purpose, because our boys are getting on their jet. The runway's set, and then Chris runs his mouth about Britney Spears, so that's our green light. Blast off, and they're in the sky. Their FA-18 soars beautifully. Meanwhile, we're taken to these two foreign dudes watching and berating the peace talks. The military men on TV say NATO forces will leave peacefully. Let's go back to the Super Hornet, where Chris navigates that jet above a lake. Jeremy thinks this might be another $1 million useless joyride.
Yet another useless joyride?
But Chris picks up some activity through his radar. Jeremy says that's a demilitarized zone, and says there shouldn't be anything there. But Chris tempts him because of the jet's new shiny camera. They go to the zone, and the camera picks up on some insurgency nearby the forest. One of them alerts their leader, who turns out to be the guy watching the TV earlier. The militia group goes on high alert. Then they target the missiles with a mobile SAM. That SAM fires, so they quickly engage evasive maneuvers. They report to base that they have been engaged, so they put out decoy flares. They have a hard time tracking and getting away from the first missile, so the Serbian coalition fires another missile. They drop their gas tanks to evade one, but the last one clips their right tail. Just at the center of the moment, the missile shoots shrapnel, then blows the jet. Both pilots survive the initial explosion, then they eject to safety. They land in a forest near a war-torn statue. At the carrier's Christmas party, Reigart's alerted of the crash, so he makes his way to the control room.
God damn it, I put him on a holiday mission.
Then he's brought up to speed on where it happened. He orders his men to contact NATO and tell Paquette as well. Back at the pilots, Chris falls from his leafy prison. Then he goes to tend to Jeremy in the open fields. He seems to have quite the wound. Chris helps him out. The two pilots don't know if the enemy saw him eject. Then Chris tries to send out a distress signal, but Jeremy says he needs higher ground for the signal to work. Chris goes for higher ground, leaving Jeremy to sit tight. Meanwhile, the Serbian rogues found those scrapped parts of the crashed jet, leaving them to cry in victory and shoot their guns in celebration. General Miroslav Lokar comes into the scene while talking to someone on how he was forced to shoot down the jet because they violated airspace rules, and they saw his troops mobilizing. He orders every part of the jet to go to someone named Granik, and that no one else touches it. Sasha Ivanich comes into play, about to show the general where the two pilots landed. We have Jeremy sitting tight and a large Serbian army headed for him, complete with men, guns, men with guns, jeeps, and BMPs. They all surround him, and then the general arrives, while Chris is helpless to watch from afar. The general makes sure that he's doing a reconnaissance mission and not a bombing one. Then he says he's alone.
Correct.
The army leaves, except for Niko Bellic over here. He takes a smoke, stands Jeremy up, and shoots him like a dog. Chris shouts in recoil, but Sasha hears it. He tells the other troops, and they open fire on Chris at the hills. Amazingly, with all that firepower, they miss. Miroslav sends both Sasha and Serb Colonel Viktor Bazda to go after him. Chris luckily reaches a high point and then radios control. Rygard and his men respond, so Chris confirms that they shot Jeremy. He tells the whole story that Jeremy was executed by another soldier, so Rygard's crew is ready to saddle up.
Stackhouse, they shot him.
The Admiral radios him coordinates of the rally point. Then they'll pick up Chris there. The Admiral asks for a green light from his fellow admirals. Then Chris is left to hike down, and his next objective? Get to that rally point. It's easier said than done when the leading GTA 4 character Sasha and the Serbian resistance is on his tail. The crew at the aircraft carrier are getting ready to move out, and Paquette is brought up to date on the crashed Super Hornet. Rygard tells him he authorized a search and rescue, but Paquette wants him to stand down.
Call it off. Stand down, Admiral.
He says that the Serbian resistance is trying to stir up the whole peace process, and that the recon mission was way out of line. This stonewalls Rygard, while the Serbian paramilitary are mobilizing. Chris makes it to the coastline, where he takes a water break, but then disaster strikes. Or rather, a Serbian with a .338 caliber sniper rifle. Chris slides down the embankment while Sasha keeps firing. Soon he slides down to a spot out of sight, as he's hanging on from plummeting. Sasha repositions while Chris escapes. Eventually, he did reach the rendezvous point where he's supposed to be picked up, so he radios control. Rygard radios him back.
I am at the rendezvous point.
And much to Chris's disappointment, a new rendezvous has been set. This time, it's miles further than the last one. Too bad the constraints with the peace treaty forced Rygard to be curt on Chris, telling him to use his head and survive. Knock knock. It's the Serbian resistance. They're nearby, but at least they don't know he's there. They lose his signal, so the Admiral's asking to triangulate his position. Chris is on the run in the woods, and the Serbs are closing in. Rygard uses drastic measures to locate Chris, specifically this secret satellite navigation room. This isn't strictly legal, but
This isn't strictly legal, sir.
they use the satellite imagery to track him on foot. They see him running from a battalion, but he trips down a ditch of mud. It turns out that the ditch is filled to the brim with discarded bodies, specifically rotting ones that the paramilitary might have executed. The Serbs try to stab him out of the ground, but eventually leave, and he crawls out of that abyss. He's on the move, and the surveillance team stays on him until the signal gets terminated. The Admiral orders his men to find intel on who's attacking Chris.
I want intel on this situation.
Sadly, Chris is left to fend for himself during the night. Then Rygard talks to Tom about his desire to push Chris into doing better, but he thinks he might have gone too far. Tom thinks that the Admiral's just responding humanely, and he says he doesn't feel right just sitting there while Chris is out in the wilderness. The Admiral says it wasn't his call to make, and then Tom's dismissed. Rygard takes a smoke, then holds the press member's card in his hand. The next day, the news breaks out that the Super Hornet had been shot down over Bosnia. Only the navigator had survived, and there's rumors of an insurgency getting in the way of a peace treaty. Well, everything about that news report is right, and then General Lokar sees it for himself. He thinks this complicates things, and he's disappointed that Chris isn't terminated yet. In their hidden quarters, one of the mechanics scrapping the Super Hornet tells the general that the photos taken are stored somewhere on the plane digitally, so he says the photos might have been destroyed. Lokar wants confirmation on that, so he sends the means to keep scrapping and searching. Back on the carrier, in Rygard's quarters, Paquette pays him a visit. He's not too happy about Rygard's tattletaling to the news media.
and you stab me in the back.
and says this might damage the peace process. Paquette emphasizes this might restart the war, and that this might do more harm than good. And speaking of harm, here's Chris running through some abandoned facility. He's snooping around. Here's an eerie laughter echoing throughout the place. Somewhere down the street, he spots an old man and two kids. He sees him giving over some tripwire that could lead him to claymores. No time to think as some soldier spots and runs after him. They try to open fire on him, but they step on one of the wires, causing a catastrophic domino effect. This blows the place to kingdom come, so Chris is running for his life. Well, he survives, only to see Sasha on his tail and scoping out the place. Chris escapes to a scrapyard in the woods, and then he radios control. He tells him he's near the safe zone and that the hard part is over.
Understand that spot to be friendly?
The Admiral confirms that the rendezvous point is friendly, and then he regrets Jeremy's demise. Now's not the time to talk about that, so the Admiral gives him a little friendly banter and actually confirms he'll be there at the spot for extraction. I guess it's the home stretch for Chris as he starts running for that safe zone while helicopters are being prepared from extraction. The extraction team is briefed for their mission, but Paquette with his men interrupt that meeting. He's already got the green light from his superiors, so he says Colonel Brigand will conduct the pickup.
He will conduct the pickup.
Paquette wants him to stand down. Back to the grizzly forest. Chris is running out of water, so he takes a short break. Moments later, Sasha's nearby. He's stalking the resting Chris, who wakes up with a traumatic memory of Jeremy's execution. He runs on a bridge where he hitchhikes to some people that don't even speak his language. They luckily accept, and he jumps to the back of the truck. Now here, he's making a little banter about guns to the locals.
9mm.
And somewhere in the back, Sasha's still tracking his movement, but this time he contacts his allies. Back on the truck, Chris kindly is asking for water, but they only have Coke, not sponsored. He also spots the young gentleman with the AK sporting an Ice Cube hoodie. In the skies, an Mi-8 helicopter spotted. It's the French NATO Special Forces rescue team. They might be here for Chris, and they're only 22 minutes away. The truck Chris is on goes through a really horrid war zone, and soon the driver is shot, and the truck takes a tumble. Chris and the others cheese out of harm's way into a fortification, where he's met with blank stares. Their mustached leader interrogates him if he was here to bomb the place, but Chris tells him that he's only here to take photos. The leader tells him Lokar's here, tearing the place to shreds.
You go outside.
So he might use him as a peace offering to Lokar's army. He berates their government for breaking the treaty, but the tank berates the entire building with an explosive shell instead. They're all knocked back, and Chris slowly gets up. Suddenly, a tank busts through the building's walls. Soldiers are seen scavenging and searching the place. Then they execute the remaining civilians. They later find the jackpot, which looks to be Chris's body and the plane's hard drive containing the photos. The troops happily report this to Lokar, but Sasha takes a look too. Upon close inspection, he says it's not him, and he knows because of a prison tattoo that even Sasha has. He totally switched uniforms, so the general's fuming and shoots the already lifeless body a few more rounds. Colonel Victor figures out that Chris might have already radioed his American buddies, so they don't have a lot of time on their hands, but the general might have a trick up his sleeve. The two are seen getting leveled by the Serbian insurgency, and then it turns out that Chris is already in one of their uniforms. The French are closing in on the rendezvous point, while Chris reunites with Ice Cube, the kid with the AK that helped him out earlier. Chris and Ice are running through the forest, while the French rescue team and the control team keep tabs on the mission. Rygart then gets some sad news. Lieutenant Chris Burnett is found executed. This was all from the Serbian insurgency, so you know it's a false claim despite showing the body, but not the face. The whole aircraft carrier watches the news. Then the announcement of the mission being scrubbed reaches the French rescue team, so only a few hundred feet away from Chris and Cube, the French retreat. Chris is in deep frustration as he watches the helicopter fly away. At the carrier, Rodway is expressing his deep frustration of doing nothing while they just watch Chris slip into the abyss. Then Rygart recoils in disbelief. At the fields, Ice Cube points out to an angel statue where Chris remembers that's where his ejector seat landed. Looks like they just went in circles. Meanwhile, the Serbian insurgency is preparing to wrap things up, as Sasha is advised to take the shot right into the head. Back to the two compadres. Chris tells him his last plan, to take the hard drive from the ejector seat so that Jeremy's sacrifice wasn't in vain. It's going to be a dangerous route, so he keeps that AK Ice gave him, and he advises him not to follow his risky mission.
Don't follow me.
They go on their separate paths, while Sasha and Colonel Victor are stuck with each other. They find Chris's discarded AK mag in the fields, so they have a clue. A lot of time passes, and it turns out Chris made his way to the snowy statue where the ejector seat landed. He scouts the area while starting Frosty, and then he makes a run for the seat. There, he dusts off the snow and notices something's wrong. The seat has no power.
God damn!
He tries to hotwire a battery to it, and with trial and error, he turns on the tracking beacon. On the opposite end, Admiral Reigart is requested to the sat-nav room. In here, the team's telling the Admiral the homing beacon had been reactivated manually for 7 minutes. The Admiral thinks it's Chris, but the others are sniffing a setup. Tom advises him to get advice from Command first, but the Admiral speaks from the heart and says this is finally their chance to rescue Chris. At the forest, we see the two Serbs trekking through a minefield, and idiotically, Colonel Victor steps on one. He doesn't let his foot go so that the mine won't go off, and Sasha holds him at gunpoint. He's begging for Sasha to help him, but it looks like he just straight abandons him. Back to the ejector seat. Chris tries to open it with a Swiss Army knife, and then he hears an explosion nearby. Yeah, probably the Colonel blowing himself up. At the hangar of the carrier, Reigart straight up says people will totally get hurt, so those who don't want to experience that, step off now. None step off. So, time to saddle up.
Let's go get our boy back.
They're not the only ones getting ready, as the Serbian coalition also picks up the ejector seat signal. 3 Blackhawks are seen leaving the carrier. It's the Admiral and his rescue team. It's all coming together on that one point, as Sasha's seen arriving at a vantage point, readying the AWP sniper rifle. He scopes out and sees Chris's hand move from the seat. Suddenly, Sasha hears helicopters approaching, so he backs off for a moment. He repositions and approaches the seat slowly, which is kind of a dumb move. He gets to the seat and it's a decoy. Told you it was dumb. Chris erupts from below and opens fire on him with a pistol. Sasha gets shot and he fires back with the sniper grazing his arm. CQC comes along and Chris stabs him with a flare. Then the Serbian coalition jumps out of the forest. Chris is making a run for it, and just as he's cornered, the Admiral and his men return fire, saving him, making a beeline for the hard drive with the photos of the civilian massacre. The rescue team provides cover fire, while Chris runs back for the rescue. They catch him. The package is secure, so they make their escape. Inside, Chris is welcomed by the Admiral and Captain Rodway. He hands over the hard drive and says that's the reason they executed Jeremy. Chris then asks for his resignation letter back because looks like he found his place in the Navy.
I think I can find it.
Once they come back, they're welcomed with celebration. Chris stays in the Navy, Lokar's found guilty of war crimes, and Reigart sadly loses his command position. He retires happily, however. Mission accomplished, cause that's it for Behind Enemy Lines. Thanks for chilling with us, guys. What'd you think about this movie inspired by real-life events? Let us know in the comments below using that hashtag #CinemaRecap. This was Behind Enemy Lines by Davis Entertainment, starring Owen Wilson, Gene Hackman, and Vladimir Mashkov. Until that next recon mission, see you then.